on the idea of the nothingness that is behind our eyes. And there is nothing much beyond our eyes. If you do a little bit of self-reflection, you'll recognize that there's very little in the way beyond beyond a perception based on a projection that's behind our eyes. And that's all behind our eyes is a projection, and a projection based on a neurological, psychological process. A neurological process causing a psychological process, a neurological interaction causing a psychological effect, interaction causing a process to happen subconsciously and consciously based on interactions inside of the body and outside of the body. And based on this enclosed barrier of a body, things on the outside and things on the inside have an effect just as much as anything else, because it's just a bunch of interactions, chaotic interactions, just a bunch of pieces, smaller pieces and smaller pieces interacting on different levels, causing different interactions. The smaller you go, the simpler it gets, but also the more interaction that you get. You start seeing things for all the complicated interaction that there is. You start seeing things for more what they really are, and just because it's smaller doesn't mean it's not complicated. It still is complicated, but by sheer numbers it's complicated more than anything. And that's more the distinction. While things are more complicated on a level that aren't necessarily by numbers, because the bigger you get, the less there's numbers, it compensates by the fact that it's just a bunch of moving parts that create these complicated things that cause them to move in different ways. And the sum of the thing is greater than its sum of its parts. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that's what's happening. That's why it's very complicated and unique, and all these different things happening, even though it doesn't mean jack diddly squat. It has some kind of meaning. It means something, that it's a process that created this feeling, the sentient things, and the sentient thing, and that's obviously requires things to work in a certain way. And it's also the process, not just by numbers, but how the things on these different levels work and interact with each other. And beyond that, beyond a projection, beyond something beyond our eyes, beyond our eyes is all we're seeing. We're perceiving. We're projecting and perceiving. We're projecting value on the things. We're perceiving things subconsciously, taking in that information, and very mechanically, even consciously understanding that our process of thinking is A to B, and that's exactly how we think. We think A to B, we recognize consciously, rationalize, we understand, even though we may put it in different words, we recognize things subconsciously that we do consciously, and it's just conscious, it's just jerking. That's all we're doing, is we're just interacting, different pieces bumping into each other. It's just a bunch of bumps going over very, 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 very rickety road, a very rickety bridge, and just a lot of movement, a lot of jerking around, a lot of swaying, a lot of a bunch of different movements happening all in different directions, and it's complicated, and it means more in the end, but it means more just because there's an interaction that creates a feeling, and the interaction of itself serves no function or practical purpose beyond creating something that feels something, and beyond that feeling there's no projection, and the projection means nothing beyond the feeling thing that creates a feeling thing created by this psychology, and the psychology is the only thing that creates meaning. And without the projection of the psychology, nothing else has meaning. So it creates something that doesn't have to exist, and doesn't have anything that doesn't it brings it in a world that has no meaning other than other things that are sentient. And that's the only thing that we're doing, is constantly fighting a battle between sentient beings and trying to find the right way to live have a fair fight, live a fair game. And that's all we're doing, is trying to find our best to interact. The more interaction there is, the more there is likely for a negative outcome in the end. The greater the negative number, the more there are people there are. But the only thing that makes it have any purpose is the interaction with other sentient beings that have feelings and interacting. Having those interactions have some kind of meaning beyond just superficial sensing. And that's all we're doing, is superficially sensing things beyond us. It's a bunch of projection. And that's all we're doing, is projecting things and interacting through things through projection. And we're experiencing things through these projections. And it's just A and B. I sense something, I think of something, something happens, an interaction happens, either from the outside leading to the inside of me, or the inside of me creating something, but it's based on an interaction experience, me existing to begin with. I have to have some kind of experience for me to have some kind of process of thinking, perceiving, having some kind of projection, and this projection just comes, it goes from A to B, it goes through the A to B process, and I think in an A to B process, because that's the only way it can happen. Obviously, it could get string in all sorts of different ways, but it's leading in a process. even if it's incoherent, even if it's not a logical process that has anything to do with reality, that's disconnected. You're part of the reality, and the reality deems it so that you work in an A to B process, because that's the only way things can work. Regardless of what you were thinking, it's working in that same function in the same way. Regardless of what you're thinking, even if you're thinking A equals C, it's A equals C. It doesn't matter. It's still A equals B. Regardless of what you're thinking, it's still a mechanical process leading to something. And that's why there's not much behind what you're doing or what you're thinking, because it's just a very mechanical process. It's just instantaneous jerks based on, it's not really instantaneous jerks, it's just jerks moving at the speed of light based on an initial interaction, causing interactions that happen in the current moment. And the current moment is based on previous interactions, and it's just the circumstances of our environment creating not only the function and the possibility of the sentience, but the sentience, the circumstance that the sentience happens to be in right now, based on previous experience too. And that's what it is. It's based on the same thing. And it's just an A to B process, thinking based on previous experiences leading to experiences that will happen later on. And there's going to be something that happens later on. Whatever it may be, it's going to be something that happens, because unless, for something to happen in the future, even if there's nothing that happened, it needed something to happen for there to be the nothing that happens in the end. So something is going to lead to something. And our interactions that we're having are just a bunch of A to B. I went to the store. I'm thinking very complicated things, and you're logically thinking about these things. You're within the boundaries of logic because you exist, and there's no living out the boundaries of logic. And we can't think outside the boundaries of logic. We can only recognize and contrive things, and we can work inside we can work outside of the logic by contriving things. But we're also working with inside the possibility in the realm that things exist, and they exist at least as a notion. And these notions can be discredited just by very simplistic thought elimination, by thinking these things through and thinking them thoroughly through, and understanding that even though it's a contrivance, it still exists as a logical thought. And just because it exists as a contrivance in my main brain doesn't mean it exists in real life, but it exists as a thought, and that's all it needs, and it's a logical thought regardless of what the thought is. Even if it is just a contrivance, it still exists as a thought, and the thought exists in and of itself, even though the thing that you're thinking about doesn't necessarily exist, either a circumstance or not a circumstance, a physical thing or not a physical thing. It exists as something. And that's exactly what means something, is the fact that it exists as something. A thought, a notion, whatever it may be, it's a process that's leading to something which is a thing in and of itself. Same thing with these thoughts that we have, this function. It's an illusion based on physical processes, and we can look at the physical processes for exactly what they are. When I view something in the back of my mind, it's just a physical process happening based on a bunch of just a brain interaction. And the brain interaction creates a visual image inside of my head, and that's really all it is a visual image. I can visualize all sorts of things, I can fantasize, but what am I really fantasizing about? I'm not really fantasizing about anything beyond the realm of logic or reason, or anything that's within the reality that I'm existing in. But just because I can think about it doesn't mean it's true. I can think about all sorts of things. I can contrive all different ideas. It's about mix and matching all these ideas that we have in these functions and these different ways of thinking and all these different things that exist, and just mixing these ideas and confusing ideas and contriving paradoxes and conundrums and contriving fake circumstances or unrealistic circumstances or circumstances or things that exist or don't exist, and just contriving things, but they still exist as a certain thing because it's just a mixture of different ideas based on real ideas that you can, even those real ideas can create contrivances out of. And the contrivances in and of themselves are much different from the circumstances. It's just mixing and matching a few key details to create something that you would call some kind of contrivance, or some kind of made-up circumstance where you're making up some kind of problem that doesn't need to exist, or some kind of contradiction, or a paradox or a conundrum or something like that that doesn't need to exist. You're just making it up, and the fact that you made it up, it makes it exist as a concept in and of itself, describing a situation that doesn't exist. And that non-existent concept as a concept or notion exists in and of itself in this reality. And it's just based off a thought process, based on the sentient being experiencing something, based on interactions around it, that's just projecting out into the world, perceiving things and projecting, saying things A, B, C, based on an interaction that caused the interaction to begin with. And I'm interacting based on my perception, perceiving things, having an input, and then outputting something based on my projection, whatever the projection may be. The projection could be anything. It's just a projection. My senses are projecting things. I'm projecting my sense of touch on the over here now that I'm projecting on the air. I'm moving through the air. It's a perception. It's a sense. It's something that's interacting with the environment around me, and it's doing nothing more than an interaction. And the interaction means something, but it's nothing more than an interaction. An A-B mechanism, equal opposite reaction, leading to a conclusion, living and existing inside the reality that I'm living in. It exists, and it doesn't matter about your brain function. It doesn't matter what you're thinking. Your mind doesn't need you to be functioning at all. It doesn't need you to be functioning the right way. It doesn't need you to come to the right conclusions. It's coming to its own conclusions because you exist in the reality, and the thing that you're thinking is existing in this reality because of the notion in your head based on a thing that's in this reality, the notion, the brain, is in this reality, and the reality explains itself, and it creates a nothingness behind your eyes. And the nothingness behind your eyes is just an A-B function based on the same mechanism. If it was another mechanism being thrust into this mechanism, even though that's a contrivance, saying that there's something outside of this mechanism that can thrust, say, this body, this being, this sentient experience is thrust into this universe from the outside, and it's not contriving anything because it's not being made by the same mechanism. But it's a contrivance because you're making up something that doesn't exist. The idea of being thrust something outside of this universe. Based on what? Based on what description of describing the reality? Based on who? Who, what, when, where, why? Who's bringing it in? Who, by what standard is there something outside of this reality? It's inside this reality that's in. There's nothing more outside of this reality. There's nothing beyond the veil that we experience as sentient beings and are interacting with on any number of levels that we're experiencing things on this reality. And that's all we're doing. A equals B. I perceive something. I interact with something based on previous interactions. I'm perceiving something. I'm taking something in. I'm interacting, whatever it may be, something in the back of my head, whatever it may be, an interaction I have inside of me, perceiving something, those subconscious and conscious things interacting, these A-B processes moving about in the back of my mind. And I project those out into the world, and I perceive it, and I use my thing called language and to describe these concepts in an A-B fashion to make it so that other people can understand them. And that's another way of understanding exactly how mechanical the process is and describing things logically so that there's a mutual understanding and how processes work in reality. And that's exactly how things are working. They're working in a very, very simplistic way. They're not working in any other way than an A-B process. But obviously, we can work beyond that. We can think things incorrectly, but things are still working by an A to B basis. It doesn't matter if you say it's A to C, because that's what I say. You say doesn't mean anything because you say is part of the A-B process, creating your existence to begin with. So you can say it. I mean, you can believe it, and you're stuck in your psychology, and you can convince yourself that that's true, but it doesn't mean that it is true. And just because you think it's true doesn't mean you're not wrong. And just because you say you're true doesn't mean you're not wrong. You could be wrong, and it doesn't matter. I mean, obviously, it doesn't have to matter to you that you're wrong or right. But obviously, there are consequences to your actions and what you think and how you have an effect on this world. And the consequences can come back and bite you. They can come back and affect you based on how you interact and what you think and what happens to happen. And you're a victim of your circumstance like everyone else, and that's exactly what creates another thing in describing this very nothingness that describes your very character. It's just a projection based on interactions causing you to work and interact in a certain way based on outside processes, causing you to exist, causing you to have these interactions to begin with, causing you to project out, to take in, perceive, and based on other interactions that existed you to begin with and all the other interactions existing outside of you, and having these things mixed together and create a perception to project out in an A-B fashion. It's a process of input and output, and that's exactly what's happening. You're inputting information, you're outputting information. A, B, I explain things A, B. I explain the process of me taking information and putting and outputting information A, B, in, out. I perceive something, I describe it A, B, in, out, describing things. It's like sex. It's very contrived. It's just it's genitals interacting with each other, going in and out of orifices, or it's just motion, thrusting. Sort of like it's just massaging. It's just rubbing against each other. It's a very simplistic process, and thinking of it as something more, obviously you can get caught up in the moment, like life. You get caught up in the moment. You could recognize these things but still get a dopamine rush, and that's all it is a physical process causing you excitement. Even though you recognize the truth, and that's all that's making us excited is these psychological, physical, chemical interactions that are having us react a certain way. And there's nothing more than these chemical reactions that we're experiencing. When you feel happy, it's a chemical reaction. It's a physical reaction. It's just it's a physical reaction. And there's nothing more to this than physical interactions. And the physical interactions are very basic and they're very simplistic. They're A/B processes. And just because they're A/B processes doesn't mean you can't get caught up. And being caught up in the game is the distraction, the illusion in which we're living our existence on. I think everyone to a certain degree understands these things. People know more than they necessarily, in many circumstances, than they let on. I think many people understand this. They just get caught up in the game too much. They have too much dopamine. They have too much serotonin. What's the word? They have too many chemicals rushing through their brain, and they're being caught up in the game far too much. It doesn't take much to recognize the truth. It doesn't take much to take a step back and recognize the big picture. Instead of getting blurred and looking through the darkness past the screen door because you're 1 inch away from it, and everything's blurry and it's dark behind it. There's nothing behind it. It's just a wall or it's darkness. Doesn't mean anything beyond the fact that if you take one step back, you can recognize the truth for what it is, and the truth is very simplistic. And all it takes is one little step backwards, and that's really all it takes to begin with. You're already in the right place. You just need to take one step backwards, and obviously this step can be a little more difficult for others, but we're all in the same place. We're just blurring our vision too much. But even if you blur your vision and you take up, it's actually, you're not blurring your vision, you're not crossing your eyes, you're confused because you're a victim of your circumstance. The circumstance is that you're too close, and you're not crossing your eyes intentionally, even though the intention is in and of itself an interaction based against your will, but using it as a metaphor, you're just caught there, you're stuck there, you don't even know you're there, and you're a victim of your circumstance, you're blinded by your circumstance. You take a step back, someone pushes you back, and you see the picture based on your interaction. And the sentience separation from this interaction is a good distinction, because your sentience is obviously a distinction between the deterministic mechanisms of this world, of this universe, and this reality, because it's something that's experiencing it and has feelings and has a force feedback mechanism of experiencing positive and negative sensations, suffering or not suffering, feeling good or feeling bad, and there's a distinction there, and the distinction is important. And it means something more, and we don't know just how much it can mean unless we have a full context into the situation that we're existing. And sometimes it takes a lot of context before we can recognize exactly the context in which we're existing. It takes a lot for some people and less for other people. It just depends on the circumstances. And the circumstances create our perception, create our A/B process. The circumstances are the things that created us to begin with, and the things that created us are A/B circumstances, and we create those A/B circumstances, very linear aligned circumstances that create an A/B process that's very simplistic. You're in that process. You're thinking about the mechanism of the universe. You're suffering from the mechanism of the universe, but the A/B process describes the suffering as well, because the suffering is created by the same function that makes us exist and makes everything else works the way it does. So you can be bothered by the fact, you can recognize and be bothered by the fact that everything is an A/B function, everything's so simplistic, but you can still get caught up in the game, you can still live in your fantasy world, you can still live in your any number of things. You can be bothered by this function, but you're thinking about it inside of the function. You're being bothered by the function and recognizing the function inside of the function. And you're trapped between a rock and a hard place, and that's one of the problems that you can't get out of in recognizing reality, like I mentioned in a previous video. It's to understanding reality and understanding that this is a problem without a solution, unless you want to talk about the problem solution that has in and of itself a way of just distracting yourself. There's no real solution. There's no solving the problem and deleting the problem. There's just a way of distracting your problem or blurring your vision and make sure you can't see. Take a step closer instead of taking a step back. Staying where you are instead of taking a step back. And it's about distracting yourself, and that's all you're doing. And that's no solution to a problem. And this is the problem that has no solution. While all the other problems leading up to it seem to have had at least some modicum of a solution in describing the situation or trying to find a way to take away from the situation, there's nothing more than a non-solution to a problem that you can only take a step forward and blur your vision from. And once you recognize it, all you can do is find ways to distract yourself against your will, recognizing it, being in denial, or doing it intentionally or not intentionally, or just getting caught up in the game because you're still a functioning human creature, still functioning inside the mechanism of the game. You're functioning inside the mechanism of the game. You still have your hungers, you still have your needs, and you're still coming into the contact with the philosophy and recognition of the intelligence that this life gives you and the circumstances give you, and the circumstance creates some cognitive dissonance between what you find desire and what you want to have desire, and sometimes those come into conflict. What you find intellectually. You intellectually come to conclude based on this reality and how they juxtapose each other in many circumstances. It's about you have cognitive dissonance and fighting against those things that you find, and using your intelligence to fight against those basal needs that you have, and just in the visceral needs and the interactions that you have on a visceral level, and the experiences you have based on your biology and your predispositions and your circumstances, and fighting those things based on this mechanism, and looking past it, and taking a step back and recognizing it's a very simplistic process controlling this whole mechanism. It doesn't need you to understand it. It only needs itself to exist to describe the situation in which you find, and describing the situation in which you exist in, describing the situation inaccurately. But obviously it's accurate, and it only means something based on the symbolism of this describing the situation. And it doesn't mean anything more than the description that we have. It doesn't mean anything more than a description. And the description is, in and of itself, very flat, because the description means nothing. The description, it only needs a mutual understanding. We don't need to describe it as best we can. We only need to describe it as best we can to get through to all other people to come to a conclusion. And it's the conclusion and it's the satisfaction that means something, and not how you get to that satisfaction. So you don't need to know everything. You only need to know the things that aren't true to come to a conclusion, at least, and prove that this is something that's true, at least compared to these other things. And in many cases, you can describe something thoroughly, that it is true to a certain degree, just by having certain information. You don't need to know everything to know that it's true or not true. You just need to know that the things that you're trying to disprove aren't true in comparison to the things that is true. So that's all I want to say. I don't want to go on, and I'm running out of battery anyway. So thank you, and until next time, bye.